good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's session. On behalf of the Chartered Accountants Cork Society, I'm Jonathan Moriarty and sit on the Cork Society Committee. I'm chairing this morning's event on cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is something that's very topical lately, as we've seen some high-profile cases with some pretty serious repercussions. So the intent over the next hour or so is just to make it as practical as possible and learn and have some takeaways regardless of your role in your organization's cybersecurity. For discussion this morning, we're fortunate to have a very great lineup of panelists, whom I'm delighted to introduce. With Fiona O'Connell, Will O'Brien, and Kevin O'Regan. Fiona is a partner with O'Flynn Exhams Company and Commercial Law Department. Her work includes advising on mergers and acquisitions, drafting advising on a wide range of commercial contracts, as well as regulatory issues, including GDPR. Fiona's lectured at UCC and at the Law Society of Ireland and is a current member of the Law Society's Business Law Committee. She contributed to a book on data protection legislation, as well as completing a Law Society certificate in data protection. Will O'Brien works at director level in PwC with overall responsibility for forensic technology, operational management and cyber incidents response. William has led work streams in a number of large and small cyber investigations throughout Ireland and Europe. He's also provided computer evidence and has given expert testimony in the Irish courts. He's also a regular speaker and guest lecturer on the subject of cybersecurity. William is GIAC certified forensic examiner and analyst. He holds the Prince 2 certificate in project management and has also completed the globally recognized leading for organizational impact credential at the Centre for Creative Leadership in Brussels. Kevin is the owner-director of Radius Technologies. He engages with clients, fully understands their needs, and to utilize leading-edge technologies as an enabler to create real commercial opportunities for them. Kevin spent the first 15 years of his working life in the electronics manufacturing sector in various operational engineering roles. Following on from that, he has spent the last 20 years working in the IT and technology sector, primarily working with Irish SME owners. Kevin has a bachelor's degree in electronic manufacturing from UL with a master's in cloud computing from MTU. So welcome everyone. Just to note as well, the event is being recorded and Fiona Collins will forward the video afterwards. Just to note as well, as the conversation progresses over the next hour, there is a Q&A box, so do pop in any questions that you do have throughout the hour there. I'll do my best to keep an eye on it, but we will have some time allocated at the end from a questions perspective as well. And also just to note, look, if you are having any technical difficulties, there is a chat box. So Fiona Collins will keep an eye on that as we progress. So maybe to start, Kevin, I might start with you, if that's okay. The recent attack on the HSE demonstrates how prevalent cyber attacks are on organizations. Can you maybe describe some of the attacks that we're currently seeing?
Sure, Jonathan, yeah. I suppose just for a brief introduction, what I'd say is that, business owners today, whether they're in the SME sector or in the enterprise level, I think they need to take responsibility at a board level for cybersecurity. I think that historically, maybe that was something that was left to a functional manager in an organization. But I think it's really important in today's world that at the top level of every organization, there's an individual who is responsible for this type of activity and is responsible to the business. I think that's very important. From the point of view of the type of attack that the SME sector is seeing today, I think that predominantly there's probably two types of attack that would be most common. One is where there's fraudulent financial transactions are created, or the environment is created where business owners are tricked into making financial transactions to criminals. And the second type of attack that's quite common, it would be a ransomware attack where business owners, their data, the data that they use to run their business is encrypted, and access is restricted. And in that situation, a ransom is requested. So they're probably the two most common types of attacks. They usually are launched through some sort of compromise of an email account, or some sort of an email trying to trick employees into providing credentials, or in some cases just clicking a link that would cause some software or a little drop of code to be downloaded onto the network. I suppose from the point of view of the secondary phases, once the initial phase is launched, what you do find then is that The situation can be compounded by firewalls that may not be configured properly, poorly patched servers and networks, multi-factor authentication not being configured on networks, and backup and replication processes also not being configured properly. From the point of view of typical examples, just briefly what I'd say is from the point of view of an email, a fraudulent email situation where funds are being requested to be paid to a criminal, it usually starts by some credentials from an employee being breached in a supplier situation. So usually a supplier of a particular company, maybe their email address of an employee is breached. And in that situation, the criminal will start to gain intelligence and profile the individuals in an organization and profile the individuals in the customer's location. And then they'll launch their attack where they will maybe request payments on certain invoices and also request where invoices are paid to a new bank account. So there are two typical type scenarios on email. Regarding ransomware, it's usually again a compromise situation where access is obtained through credentials being granted to the credentials being granted to the criminals, and in that case, then they will gain access to the network and they will maybe remove antivirus and just create an atmosphere where the entire network, all the data is encrypted. So there'll be two typical type scenarios.
Okay, thanks. I guess maybe in both scenarios, it sounds like maybe the employee or someone within the organization plays a bit of a role, obviously pretty unwittingly, but typically it would involve somebody with it within the organization.
Usually it does, yeah, unfortunately, and probably one of the key areas there is in awareness for staff, you know. It's probably seems to be one of the most basic areas, but it is an area where you can get the most return, where you increase the awareness of staff on the type of emails that they may be exposed to, the type of fraudulent social engineering type emails where your employees are attempted to be tricked into providing some information or tricked into clicking a link that will cause some code to be downloaded on the network. So unfortunately, employees, you know, can be at the cold face of it, but it's always, you know, usually, you know, where employees are tricked. It's not necessarily where there's an internal threat or something like that, you know.
Right. Okay. And in relation to the current environment with COVID over the last sort of 15, 16 months, and, you know, obviously lots of organizations working remotely, has that had much of an impact or changed the risk profile across the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, you know, I suppose the big change with COVID was that it was a reaction, and it you know, none of us had very much time to plan how we were going to react. Everybody had to work from home. And in that type of environment where you move quickly and you don't always have time to plan the best, what you find is that you certainly have an increased risk in regard to, I suppose, working from home. There's an increased exposure in new technology. You know, there's new connections into your network. There are devices that are in your employees' homes that may be used by other family members, for example. So, you know, there's a whole load of extra exposure there that is needed to be looked at and needs to be analyzed and needs to be, I suppose, secured on top of what we traditionally would have been looking at on where we had all our employees in the office.
Okay, perfect. Fiona, I know one thing you'd mentioned maybe was in relation to that new environment, maybe from working from home. You know, from a data regulation perspective, I think there's been additional guidance there.
I think what I would say is the Data Protection Commissioner has been pretty swift, and there's, you know, I appreciate there are a mix of people at this seminar this morning. Some people will have very, very sophisticated data protection departments. You'll have a data protection officer, and others will be SMEs with, you know, not a lot of resources. But the Data Protection Commissioner's website has a specialist area dedicated to COVID-19, and there's very good practical guidance there that I'd certainly recommend everybody to look at. You know, it covers the basic things like Kevin mentioned. You know, laptops, you know, shouldn't be kept open. They shouldn't be accessed by family members. You should have strong passwords. Really basic things, and then there's more sophisticated guidance as well, depending on the type of business you are. So I'd recommend people, if they haven't already looked at it, and particularly if you're an SME and you don't have a lot of resources, to have a look there.
Thanks, Fiona. Kevin, I might ask you maybe just about, I suppose, the high-profile case we've seen in the news over the last number of weeks in relation to the HSE and obviously the aftermath and disruption that they have experienced. Is that typical for an organisation maybe that's had an attack, to see that sort of level of disruption?
Well, I suppose obviously the HSE is a huge organisation, and it would be unusual, you know, from that point of view, in regard to the sheer volume of end users and the sheer volume of the size of the network would be quite unusual. But I suppose from the point of view of the impact on businesses, you know, we need to be very careful, because it can be very, very severe. I think where organizations do plan and look at their own business in terms of what the business can sustain, and invest in a backup and replication and recovery plan, and test that plan, I think they can significantly reduce their exposure regarding disruption. Unfortunately, you know, there are a level of statistics out there that would talk about the number of businesses, particularly in the SME sector, that never recover from a pretty harsh, particularly ransomware attack, where, you know, backups are actually fully taken out, data is fully taken out, and the business owner really has nothing left other than to start from scratch. And, you know, if you're looking at a debtors list, and, you know, you need to get money in and you don't know who owes you money, in some instances it can be as severe as that. But I think once you plan ahead, and once you invest in your recovery plan, I think it can be minimized. And if you set a target, you know, your target can be an hour, it can be a day, or it can be a week. Once you set your target and you know your business can withstand that level of disruption and test to it, I think that you'd be in a much better place.
In relation to that readiness plan that you talked about there, Kevin, what would be the main components within that?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a pretty holistic approach across the entire organization. I think certainly from the point of view of your staff, you know, education and increasing awareness is absolutely key. You know, you've got to educate your staff on how these attacks are launched and what to look out for. Malware protection is a critical part of any plan, and some of the traditional type malware protection would be signature based, or I suppose based on historical events. But other malware protection, which would be based on behaviors or behavior of software, could be used to protect against stuff like zero-day attack. Your backups, local offsite backups, replication is key. I think what's really important for business owners, and this goes right to the top of the organization, is you absolutely have to know what data has been backed up, and probably more importantly, what data is not being backed up. And we have seen instances where, you know, company owners believe that their data has been backed up, and when they actually go and look and see what the inventory is of that data, some key data is missing. So I think that that's very important. Multi-factor authentication when you're logging on to networks is a key part of your toolkit. You know, historically we were granted access to systems based on what we knew, which was our password. But I think in a multi-factor authentication scenario, you also have to rely on something that you have in your possession. So, you know, you provide a piece of information, which is your password, but then your mobile phone is used to produce a second piece of information, which proves you own, or you're in possession of a specific mobile phone. I think that, that's very important. Updates and patching of your network servers, absolutely critical. Hardening of your network internally. So, you know, once a hacker does gain access to your network, you have to make sure that once he's in there or she's in there, that it's a really harsh environment for them, and moving around and making changes and manipulating the environment needs to be very difficult for that to be done. Again, identify what your return time objective is. That's absolutely key. You need to know what level of downtime your business can sustain, and then you need to put a plan in place to meet that level of disruption. Test your plan. You know, every quarter, every 6 months, test the plan and make sure that your business is recoverable. And I think, you know, a detailed cybersecurity review, you know, a branch and root review of your entire organization is probably a good starting point. And again, I would suggest that, you know, sometimes a fresh pair of eyes is very valuable in a situation like this, that you don't use, say, a member of your team that has been used to looking at your IT network or your cybersecurity configurations. Use a fresh pair of eyes and do a complete review of your entire system.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. Is that, you know, you touched on it there, maybe the attendees on the call this morning, it's from a broad range of different backgrounds and sizes organization as well. That level of expertise to you know, go through what you talked about from a readiness plan, is that, you know, should organizations maybe look externally depending on size, or as you put it there, maybe not be overly dependent on in-house expertise?
Yeah, I think that you know, third parties and external resources would be a key part of the solution, particularly for the SME sector. I think like there's quite a broad range of skills required to put a full plan in place. So you need somebody maybe at a systems level or at a kind of a planning level that can maybe put all the elements up on the table that need to be discussed and need to be reviewed. And then you have very specific technical skills where you need to maybe put in place you know, certain replication, certain high availability technical solutions to give you that level of availability in the event of an attack. So the fact that it's such a broad range of skills and the fact that they're highly specialized, I think in a lot of cases, the SME sector, you know, it's not a viable business model to bring in all the skills on a permanent basis. Certainly, I think it's a good idea to maybe pick a champion within the organization who would be, you know, be the person who leads the team and leads initiatives. But that either has to be someone at the board table or at a managing director level, at a senior level, or someone who reports directly into them.
Okay, perfect. I guess maybe if somebody's looking to maybe go beyond that and maybe looking to invest in something maybe from a system perspective, is there maybe some key areas that they could focus their investment on, or is it simply the plan, even looking at maybe some technologies to, I don't know, check your or something that can potentially see if you have any weaknesses?
I think probably the most significant investment for any SME owner would be to look at your recovery plans, you know, your disaster recovery plan, your business continuity plan, and the technology that you need to invest in to achieve your recovery time objective. I know I keep repeating that term, but I think it's absolutely key. You know, the amount of downtime that your business can sustain will be directly related to the investment that you need to make. So in some cases, business owners with a very high level of transaction will say that they can sustain zero downtime, that they literally, as soon as one system is taken out, that another system within milliseconds, you know, needs to take over. And in that case, obviously, that's quite a significant investment, but it does give you the level of resilience that, you know, some business owners need. And, you know, moving down along the scale, some business owners may say an hour, some business owners may say a day or a week, and each of those decisions significantly impacts the investment. So in a way, when you're looking at your disaster recovery, you're almost accepting that, you know, that there will be a hit at some point, that you will be at the receiving end of a cyber attack that does take a certain part of your system out. But what you're saying is that we've invested in something that would allow us to recover. So I think that's probably the key area of investment. And then malware protection tools, that would obviously make the attack as difficult as possible for criminals is very important. And investing in awareness, there are programs out there where you can, I suppose, create a campaign yourself for your employees, where you have almost a phishing simulation program, where you as the business owner are launching the emails to your staff, and you're monitoring how they react to them. And then you give feedback and you say, look, we've done this campaign last week. We sent out 50 emails. We had five staff members open these mails, and you feedback and you try and improve that type of awareness. So I think there are 3 key investment areas.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah.
I suppose in an ideal world, you've all the readiness done, and you avoid these things. But I suspect that's not always a reality. Will, I might ask you about maybe in the unfortunate circumstances, maybe where you have been a victim of an attack, and how do you prepare for that, and what kind of plans do you need to put in place to make sure that you are, I suppose, that you're also ready to react in the circumstances where maybe you're a little on the back foot.
Yeah, well, I suppose to Kevin made some really good points there in terms of, I suppose, having a plan and road testing that plan along the way. I think just to kind of to add a few points there, I suppose he mentioned the champion internally within the organization. That champion's going to need support as well, and that support can be, for example, that if you're an organization, you're hit with a ransomware attack, for example, your payroll systems could be completely taken out. Suddenly, you're going to have a critical issue when you're trying to run your next payroll operation. You may, for example, need legal support. For example, like Fiona mentioned, you have a major cyber incident. There's been a data leakage. You may need some advice and assistance in terms of in terms of reporting it to the Data Protection Commissioner. Other organizations, for example, where they have they may have a large book of customers. Suddenly, if your brand is hit with a major cyber attack, you could increase a big spike of customers ringing your organization concerned about their data has been leaked to the organization. So, for example, that you need to consider the supports there in terms of how are you actually going to manage those kind of customer queries, for example. And a lot of organizations would also have a PR agency to help them to manage the message and ultimately help minimize the risk to their brand and reputation. And then there's also, I suppose, the IT element, not just your internal IT resources who will who help you kind of keep the lights on, so to speak, and your business operating on a day-to-day basis. You may need to actually investigate an incident as well. And I suppose forensics and a forensic investigation may be required to understand, for example, if a business has 1,000 customers, you may need to be able to actually perform a forensic investigation to identify which customers were impacted. And then that ultimately helps to inform your recovery strategy and your reporting strategy to those customers. So to Kevin's point, having that champion, so to speak, but making sure then that they have the supports. And it's something as simple as having a call tree effectively. So in the case of an emergency, who are you going to call and who's going to be there to support you in those kind of minutes, hours and days during your recovery strategy?
Yeah, okay, thanks. Well, it sounds like going a step beyond maybe your typical business continuity planning, which I suspect for a lot of people is maybe some natural disasters, loss of power, or working from home. But it's that maybe customer impacting piece as well that you touched on.
Yeah, I'll just give you an example. Like last week, we were helping a client who was hit with a major ransomware attack, and a number of their facilities were taken out. And the business owner rang us in a kind of a very much reactionary fashion, and they'd probably been they were hit on a Monday morning at 9 o'clock, and they didn't pick up the phone to us till probably 5 o'clock that evening. And I was just on the call, just trying to get an understanding of the incident, and they had their IT support was in helping them during the incident. And he actually said to me it was the first time that he's actually gotten IT into a room and he's whiteboarded how their organization is set up from a technical perspective. And he said it's actually he was actually now getting an understanding of how their systems and their technology works. And that's mid-crisis where he's been hit with a ransomware demand to get operations back up and running. And it was just that lesson there of it's road testing it, maybe it's, Kevin mentioned quarterly, maybe it's even in road once a year where you get your senior business people to take a day out of the business, and could even be a Saturday, and you say, well, actually, we're going to actually run. It's like a fire drill. What happens when the fire alarm goes out? Where are all our people going to go? It's the same for anything cyber related. Having that kind of fire drill, that preparation, testing it, so that if it does happen, that you're better prepared. And again, for many of those kind of sessions when you're kind of road testing your incident response plan, it's taking down the lessons learned, because if you are hit with a cyber attack, that's really what you're going to be involved in, and that often happens when you're in those kind of what they call war room scenarios where you're trying to actually recover from a major incident.
Right. And is it always obvious when you've been attacked, maybe striking that balance between someone's just phishing and maybe has some bit of information versus hacked, or is it always pretty obvious, is it?
Well, it's not, because I suppose, when you're looking at, I suppose, the cyber criminals and their techniques, it's not always obvious. So again, like what they'll to I suppose to ensure that they have maximum impact, and especially when you're looking at ransomware, it's so topical right now. If they get access to your systems, for example, they will, the first thing they'll go for is those detection controls. So again, the antivirus software, as an example, they try and disable those. So then what they'll try and do is gain a foothold within your organization to gain intelligence. So if they're going to perpetrate a ransomware attack, it's number one, they'll look for the key data that they can actually try and exfiltrate from the organization. And again, they'll want to do that while they're being undetected. Then once they get the data out, then they will, as Kevin said, they'll go after and they'll try and identify your backup systems to try and disable or delete your backups. And then they'll wait for the opportune moment to strike their attack. And typically what we see is attacks are probably they're perpetrated, so that's where they detonate the ransomware. And it typically happens on a Friday evening, and often happens on bank holiday weekends, where they know that they're going to have 2 to 3 days to actually spread their encryption across your network. So suddenly, it's the phone rings on a Monday or Tuesday morning. People are coming back into the business after a weekend off, and everything's encrypted, and they can't get access to the data. And that's the first time then that they'll actually, you'll have the ransomware screen up in front of you, and you're being hit with a ransomware demand. And because they've had that time within your environment and they've been undetected, once you go to look at your backups, what we're seeing with a lot of businesses now, once they're hit, is their backups have either been disabled or deleted from a significant time before the incident. So again, maximum disruption. And then it's really, forcing the business to consider, well, if we do want to recover, are we actually going to have to pay that ransom? And it's a really challenging time for any business to be involved in.
Yeah, and it is, yeah, and that's a very difficult dilemma, I guess. Is it worth engaging with your hacker, or is there any benefit to opening a line of communication there?
Well, I suppose we'd always recommend that you don't, right? Because I suppose ultimately you can be funding financial or criminal gangs. There's also a risk of being seen to be kind of helping kind of with money laundering. So again, you just don't know who you're going to be interacting with there. So again, there could be obviously there's a criminal element to it, right? I think just going back to, I suppose, that kind of, testing your incident response plans, we'll often during those plans, again, it's in terms of the for example, like a lot of ransomware, they're looking for payment in Bitcoin. We've seen businesses that have made decisions to actually, pay the ransom. But the next challenge then they're hit with is that it can actually take them, 2 days to purchase and transfer the ransom demand in Bitcoin. So we see a lot of organizations that they plan for the worst, but they're preparing at the same time that if they do have to actually pay a ransom and they do have to get a Bitcoin quite quickly, that they're actually prepared for that eventuality. But that's typically the worst case scenario, and you don't want to be in that situation. But I think it's kind of, again, like to Kevin's earlier points, like that if you're testing your environment, you have good incident response plans, you have those external supports, you're minimizing your risk as well, and then ultimately you're taking the lessons learned. And I think those lessons learned are really important, because sometimes when you're making those investments in IT, you need to understand that sometimes you might be getting advice from an external third party who are managing your IT, or an internal in-house function. They need to also understand, I suppose, what are the critical systems that can't afford to be impacted during a cyber attack. And it's bringing that business knowledge and IT knowledge together to really plan out where your key investments need to be made. And then just, I think the final point where we're seeing a lot of other businesses now, it's like that they're not just relying on their in-house IT function or their third-party IT function, but they're also relying on a level of assurance. So once a year, they might get an independent third party in to do kind of what they'll call is a cyber health check. So again, it's to validate that what their either in-house IT function are doing or their external support IT function are doing, just to ensure that they're looking in the right areas and they're reducing their cyber risk where possible. So ultimately, as part of those cyber health checks, they're getting a kind of a roadmap where they should be making key investments for the year ahead.
Right. Okay. In the instance, typically when a crime has been committed and you're the victim, you tend to go to your authorities, the guards or whatever. Is there any authorities that can support here, or is it kind of predominantly kind of back on yourself to walk through what you need to do to kind of get back up and running?
Yeah, well, like, look, I think that there are really good supports. Even the guards have really good supports now in these areas that for businesses that are impacted. The government are doing a lot of work in, I suppose, that educational area, getting out key messages on media and social media, for example. And you can see even like the National Cybersecurity Centre, for example, they're getting a lot of very good information out there. But look, after the HSE attack, it's kind of been widely publicised. The likes of the National Cybersecurity Centre are very underfunded. And what you'll see is with a lot of those organizations that what they say is like, we'll only just come as far as your firewall, so we can give you some general advice. But for a lot of businesses, when they're hit with an incident, it's really those kind of it's like Kevin's company, for example, helping you with the support and rebuilding the environment. It's like getting that kind of legal advice, for example, in terms of reporting to the Data Protection Commissioner, having those, again, as I was saying, the call tree, those third parties that you can trust, you've dealt with in the past, but ultimately that they'll be there for you, especially for a small to medium-sized business, that you have those trusted advisors effectively that will actually help you during an incident and manage you through it to help you actually rebuild your environment. And then ultimately it's going to be your staff, and Kevin did mention that training and awareness piece. That's I suppose like it's having those trusted and loyal staff within your organization, and ensuring that they understand their role and responsibility during a cyber incident. That's really critical. And ultimately it's your best chance of success if you're facing a cyber incident.
Right. Okay. I might obviously this is a significant risk that faces any organisation, and you know, obviously you got your readiness plan and maybe a reactive plan. How about from an insurance perspective? You know, can you maybe give a bit more detail maybe on what's involved with a typical sort of an insurance policy from a cyber perspective?
Yeah, so like I suppose, you know, what we're actually seeing that a number of insurers have come out with cyber insurance over recent years, and obviously given the rise of cyber crime, those policies are becoming more and more popular. I suppose typically what you see is that within those insurance policies, and again the devil's in the detail, right? That there's a certain level of cover during an incident. So typically what they'll do is they'll stand up kind of a response plan for you. So where you'll have maybe 36 or 72 hours during an incident where you'll have key support during that incident. So that might be legal support for your data protection advice and your customer advice. Again, it might be PR support for your brand. And then there'll be an element of you know, forensic technology to help you with cyber investigation. But what you'll often find is obviously the policy will vary, and you know at some cases, you know, as I was saying, it could be 36 or 72 hours of support. But once you hit those thresholds from a timeline perspective, then, for example, the business then has to cover the cost for those types of professional supports, continuing to support them during an incident. So it really does depend in terms of, you know, how long you think you know, how long could you survive during a major outage, and Kevin, you know, mentioned this earlier as well. Again, having that kind of, you know, scenario plan in terms of, you know, again, how, you know, can you survive, you know, minutes, hours, or days due to a critical cyber incident? How long are you going to actually need those supports during an incident as well? But like what we often find then as well is that the people that even have the cyber insurance, they're not even planning, like, so the first time they're making the call into their insurer is when they have the incident. So again, like that, a lot of people are buying the policy and they're going, oh, that's great, we have cyber insurance, but they haven't actually read into the detail. They're not aware of what they're covered, and then, you know, that it's the first time they're actually you know, contacting insurers is when they have a major incident. So again, it's all about preparing and understanding, you know, it's about understanding what cover you have. And then ultimately, the most important part of it is what are the limitations to your cover? And then if there are limitations, can your business survive and live with those limitations within the insurance cover? So it's taking the time to review your policy in detail.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. And is insurance the only avenue we tend to see, maybe from a recourse perspective? I'm not sure where else you maybe might look for satisfaction, but
yeah. So like, look, I suppose what we see is, with the majority of cyber attacks, there is a cross-jurisdictional element to them, you know. So again, like, you know, again, it's well publicized, where you have like Eastern Europe, Russia, North Korea, where you have these, you know, criminal gangs and nation states, you know, conducting their attacks from there. So if you're, again, you know, if you perform an investigation after a cyber incident, you can get a lot of in-depth detail, which you can then obviously, you know, formulate as part of your reporting strategy. So for example, that if your data has been stolen, you will be obliged to investigate the cyber incident. And during that investigation, you can typically find where, I suppose, what jurisdiction the attack occurred from, you know, by analysing things like IP addresses and other artifacts and evidence that's gathered during the incident. You know, typically then you're reporting that to the guards, and then, you know, it becomes very challenging once it's a cross-jurisdictional investigation. They they will obviously interact with their colleagues like Interpol, but I suppose the nature of recourse, you know, it can be extremely challenging. And maybe I suppose, maybe Fiona, I might just bring her in here because she'll be more familiar with it from a GDPR perspective. I think where businesses need to be careful is really, I suppose, around the GDPR element of it. I suppose, you can have a major outage from a cyber incident. If your data is stolen, your business can have a major brand and reputational impact. But I suppose there are kind of significant fines, that can be imposed on businesses as a result of the of GDPR. So again, I suppose it all goes back to, I suppose, some of the key messages that Kevin and myself have raised about, preparing, trying to put in the controls within your organization, road testing it, and ultimately trying to reduce your cyber risk. So again, that you're minimizing the impact against your business if you are impacted.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, Fiona, I'm not sure. Can you maybe give us a bit of an overview of what's involved? Because I suppose the focus that Will and Kevin have talked about is maybe from a business perspective and that recovery and getting up and running again. But there is some important obligations there from a data protection perspective.
Yeah. Hi everybody. I have to say, just to link in what Kevin and Will were saying, I mean, the essence, I suppose, of GDPR is essentially accountability. You are accountable. You must demonstrate how you're complying with it. And that follows through then to, in terms of not just on GDPR, but in terms of the business, have you proper, say, data protection policies in place? Have you business interruption policies in place? Are you making records of your processing, and are your policies transparent? And I mean, one of the major, I suppose, consequences, and the question that we get asked by clients is basically, what is a data breach? Because it's something that it may be the first time they've ever encountered it, and it's not something they've been thinking about on a day-to-day basis. And I suppose a personal data breach is a breach of security leading to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss of data. And personal data is data which identifies a person, directly or indirectly. And I suppose and that breach can occur, due to a deliberate act, as Will and Kevin are saying, due to phishing attack or ransomware attack, or it could be human error. It could be accidental. Somebody could, accidentally BCC all users, and people's email addresses are shared. To take it really simple. And I suppose a personal data breach, in simple terms, is something that it negatively impacts on, confidentiality, integrity, or availability. And what does that really mean? I suppose it means three things in terms, just to kind of explain, what a breach is. A confidentiality breach, if there's accidental disclosure. An integrity breach, whereby, there could be unauthorized or accidental alteration of the data. Or then an availability breach is, what has happened with the HSE. There's loss of access to the data, or it's destroyed, or, so that's what a breach is. And the main question I think people ask, breach, what do I have to do? And I suppose what you have to do jumps into two categories, really. Firstly, you may have to notify the Data Protection Commissioner, and secondly, you may have to notify data subjects. And obviously, this has huge consequences, because damage which you can't buy back, and there's loss of trust. It suddenly, the data breach casts a shadow on what people are doing with data anyway. Are they keeping it too long? Have they too much data? Have they not been complying with other basic requirements of data protection? So the question that we're really asked, I think, Jonathan, and it links back to what I suppose Kevin and Will were saying in terms of why you need to have data breach protocols and business interruption protocols, is you may have to notify the Data Protection Commissioner unless you can demonstrate it's unlikely to result in a risk to the data subject. And I'll come back to that in a second. So do you now have to notify the supervisory authority? You need to analyze, is it going to result in a risk to data subjects? And secondly then, do you have to communicate with data subjects? And it's really, in that situation, it's if there's a high risk to the data subject, in that situation, you have to notify them. And really, throughout all of this, data controllers and data processors must document what they have done. And this goes back to Will and Kevin's point about having a plan in place. You must document, when did the breach happen? How did you deal with it? What mitigating steps? So whether you have to notify the Data Protection Commissioner or whether you have to notify data subjects, you have to document what you were doing throughout the data breach. And I think that leads into a whole risk analysis piece. The difficulty is assessing, and that do I have to notify the Data Protection Commissioner or do I have to notify data subjects? And the inclination of most people has been up to now to actually do the notifications because they're afraid that they will be liable to fines or damages if they don't. And that has kind of come out. Even the most recent data protection report, the 2020 report of the Data Protection Commissioner said, we've had 10,000 notifications, but we really only needed 65% notifications. People over notified because they're fear of breach. So it goes back to really analysing, should you notify? And there's really good guidance available in 2 documents out there for businesses who don't have sophisticated data protection departments, who don't have data protection officers appointed, who don't have access to resources. The European Data Protection Board has produced 2 really good documents which essentially set out simple examples as to what you should do if your data is compromised. And it sets out even, steps that you should be taking after those compromises. So without getting into them, I can make them available afterwards to Fiona and you can share them with people. But there is guidance out there as to say, if you have a ransomware attack, if you have an accidental loss of data, what steps should you be taking? And it helps businesses analysing as to whether or not they have to notify. So, and the types of, yeah, go ahead there, Jonathan.
I was just going to ask you if you want to, in relation to, if you are in that space, and it sounds like maybe people aren't always clear if they need to do a notification or not. How quickly does that need to be done?
Yeah, I suppose that in terms of notifying the supervisory authority, it's within 72 hours. So it's a really short time frame, within 72 hours of becoming aware of the attack. So, you're really, that seems to be, it's a very short window. And in that, you need to analyse as well, have you processors as well out there who may have been breached? So it's really important that you have proper contracts in place, say with anybody. If your processor notifies you that there's a breach, then the onus is on you, on the controller, to notify the supervisory authority. So it's within 72 hours. So it's a really short window.
Yeah. And just to add to that, Fiona, to that point around the processors, we're seeing more and more organizations looking at their third party risk. So just a very simple example, if you're running a small business and you've outsourced your payroll to a company, if that payroll outsourcing company gets hacked and they have a data breach, as a data controller, you have an obligation to report that to the Data Protection Commissioner as well. So again, it's not only just looking at what you're managing internally yourself. You also need to consider, from a cyber security perspective, who are your third parties? So where is your data sitting outside of your organization, and how are those third parties protecting their data, and what kind of notifications will they give you as an organization if they're impacted by a cyber attack and a data breach?
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point, and really just, I think to link back to what Kevin and Will have said, like in really simple terms, to we're talking about cyber attacks, but really you could obviously have accidental breaches as well. So in really simple terms, have you got a plan, a simple plan as to what will happen if you've a data breach or if you've business interruption? The second thing then is, as they said, have you trained your staff? Have you booked off a half day once a year to train your staff? Thirdly, what does your insurance say? And to link back to what Will said, I think it's really important. Cyber insurance is, you have to look at the detail. I was looking at for a recent acquisition, a cyber insurance policy, and our client was purchasing, and they came to us and said, no, this is great. These guys have a fantastic cyber security policy. We got it analysed by the broker. It didn't cover any data breaches, and this was an organisation holding, masses of sensitive data. So the cyber insurance policy was essentially useless. So they had to look at costing, putting in a proper policy, and just in simple terms, for any business, whether you're in business yourself or whether you decide you're going to put your business up for sale, or each time a business is put up for sale now, before you'd have 2 lines of questions on business continuity, business interruption, and questions on data breaches. Now you have 3 or 4 pages of warranties, people asking those questions because it's so important, and the risk of non-compliance it's going to cost you money.
I think that, sorry, just to make one point there, Fiona, we touched on COVID-19 earlier on and the impact of COVID-19. I think that an interesting aspect of COVID-19 is in terms of your data, and not so much a cybersecurity event, but like a genuine breach where, employees now are working from home. There's a higher risk that data is moved about physically or moved about on laptops, and I think that business owners need to look at their entire, I suppose, infrastructure and their entire IT environment to make sure that they've minimized the risk of an accident or a mistake being made as much as an attack. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, I do. And I think the way you deal with all of these things is, and nobody likes having, reams of policies, but having basic policies makes you actually think about risk management. And it's all about risk management and trying to make sure the business does continue, and to, if you analyze the risks, you're going to be looking at it all the time, as Will and Kevin said. You need to update it, technology changes, the way people do business change. But it's all about having policies, and as Kevin said at the very beginning, it goes up to the top. It's good corporate governance.
Yeah.
All of this stuff that we're talking about is all about essentially trying to enable businesses to continue with as little disruption. Now, things happen all the time. That's why we all are we're all here, because we meet people in trouble and in crisis all the time. But it's really trying to look beyond the crisis and to try and do a bit of planning. I think that's really what I would say.
Yeah, and also to invest in the type of technology that would minimize the risk, where for example, like a full cloud computing solution would ensure that the data never leaves the data center. Your staff accessing data in a safe environment, as opposed to data moving around to different locations would improve the situation significantly. There's one other point that I just wanted to make, Jonathan, and it hasn't really come up in the conversation. I think it's very important. It's just about accreditations. You talked about investing in robust systems. There are a number of accreditations out there that may be of interest to business owners, and obviously stuff like ISO 27000 would be kind of the gold standard and up at one end of the scale. But for example, there's a really nice accreditation that originated in the UK, and it's called the Cyber Essentials accreditation, and that's designed for SME owners to be able to withstand a random cyber attack. And I think that's well worth looking at. And I know, Will, you've also looked at certain standards that may be specifically suited to accountants, I believe. So I know that that's a really important area as well. Sure.
Thanks, Kevin. We're the time is slipping away on us. I was hoping to allocate maybe some time to questions. We might just take maybe one or two before we finish up in the next couple of minutes. So we've had, maybe Kevin, you've touched on it there, but in relation to the question around backup, does having a backup in the cloud, does that make it impossible for hackers to destroy your data or access your backup?
I think, look, like one thing you have to say is you never say never regarding, cyber security, etc. And you always have to just do best endeavor. But I think that, traditional backups were located on premise, or were local backups where there was a direct connection to your storage. And in those cases, yes, there's a very high exposure. Cloud backups, if they're configured properly, where there's a complete segregation of your IT infrastructure and where your data is backed up, can be very, very successful, and would be, I think, really, really recommended for SMEs. So we recommend local backups and cloud-based backups to protect you in that scenario.
The one thing I'd add to that as well, it would be, again, just ask the right question. So if you're paying a third party for a cloud service like backups, again, just put the scenario to them, like, if we're hit with a ransomware attack locally, what happens to our backup data? What protection and controls and authentication are they putting in place to mitigate the risk of the ransomware spreading from your local environment out to the cloud and the cloud backup environment? So again, empowering yourself with the right questions to ask. And, if you're not getting satisfactory answers from that third party, you need to probably be asking yourself, like, are we with the right provider, and do we need to shop around for an alternative cloud service backup provider?
Okay, perfect, thanks. We just time for one more. Fiona, you're maybe best placed to answer this. It's quite a specific question around what advice can you give if your IT consultant who handles that is not willing to sign a GDPR contract between them and the company? And I suppose maybe, is there implications there because of that?
Yeah, I'm assuming you're talking about a processing agreement, and I don't see why they wouldn't. I mean, the usual fights over those contracts are, if you're trying to look for an indemnity from, one person and they're resisting that indemnity, or they want to cap it. But, you should have, if it depends on, I'm assuming the IT service provider is providing processing work. What's the nature of the service? In terms of when you're talking about a GDPR agreement, is it a processing agreement? Because they should be signing the processing agreement. There's no reason why they shouldn't. That would be the onus on you as the data controller to ensure you proper processing agreement. So I think there's something wrong there. They should be signing the processing agreement. Now, the commercial terms of the processing agreement are a different situation, but as a matter of law, you as the controller have to have a processing agreement with them. So, maybe go back to them and say, look, is it the case that there are issues with the commercials? And if that's the case, then that's just be knocked on the head.
Okay, thanks, Fiona. Just for wrap up, I do want to mention that the Chartered Accountants Ireland, they offer a certificate in technology risk and data incident management as well. So Fiona Collins will include details in that as well when she sends out the link for the video as well. So the hour has come up on us. It kind of flew by, to be fair. So thanks everyone for attending, and also a sincere thanks to all the panelists for their time as well, obviously in the preparation as well. So thanks Fiona, Will and Kevin. Probably last point to finish, look, if there are any other topics or events that you would like the Cork Society to run, don't be afraid to drop Fiona Collins an email, and she'll get back to you as well. So brilliant. So again, thanks, as I said, thanks Will, thanks Fiona, and thanks Kevin. That was a fascinating discussion, and hopefully everyone found that useful.